Um, welcome to our series here. We're going to do hopefully 10 sessions. We'll see if it takes more than that, but the goal is 10 sessions to review all of the 2025 GAR contracts. We're going to start today with the in-depth of the purchase and sale agreement. This is part one. We plan on probably doing part two. Well, definitely doing part two and hopefully not having to do part three because that'll throw our schedule off. But that's the plan at the moment. So we are recording. So you can come back to this if you would like. And then, of course, if you have friends that you think could use some contract help, please don't hesitate to share this with them because we do want people to write better contracts. All right, so let's get started. First, some basic concepts. Before we get into this particular contract, let's talk about contractual things. Let me go back. Disclaimer, not a lawyer. Don't even play one on TV. So please, if you have, uh, you know, questions, these are opinions and my interpretation, not the law, right? So consult with your broker, which for many of you, that's me also, but also an attorney if you have legit questions. I personally like to call Seth Wiseman directly because he's the one that wrote most of this, and so that way, if I need a question, I can do that. All right, basic concepts. The contract is the only thing that matters. All the conversation, all the emails back and forth, all the promises, all the hopes and dreams, none of that matters unless it's written in the contract, right? A contract can be accepted and still be voidable. So you need to be aware that your contract needs to be complete in order for it to be enforceable. Um, an offer is countered and a contract is amended. Every now and then we run into some things where I see people trying to amend things that aren't binding. It's hard to amend an offer. You have to have a contract first. Special stipulations. This is one we're going to spend a whole session on, so we won't talk too much about it. But it has to have the who, what, when, consequences if it's not done. This is a big one that most people forget. The assumption is well, the contract will just be dead, right? Like they've violated the contract. Well, yeah, but you want to be more specific than that if you can, and may need to be contractually removed. Most situations, which is my code word for problems, hiccups, issues, all those sorts of things, occur as a result of poor verbiage. Okay. I know we are not lawyers. And so when you go to write a special stipulation or write something in the contract other than just filling in the blanks, which we'll go over, you need to make sure that it's written well. It's always helpful to have an attorney in your pocket or a broker that you can call and make sure that what you're saying is what you should be saying. Um, Due diligence removal, special stipulations, all of those require the same construction of things. Notifications do not require party signatures, both party signatures, sorry, just one. Um, Counter offer forms help keep the contract clean and clear. Cleaned up contracts, which is getting less and less common, but even after the counter offer form had been out for a while, we still saw people requesting clean copies of the contract, which is just a landmine waiting to go off in my mind. And I think it's always a great idea to have a transaction narrative in your file. So, transaction narrative is just a document where you write down the dates and times of what things are happening, right? Like, when did I first show the property? When did I write the offer? When did we get the response? When did we say this? When did we do the inspection? All those sorts of things. Because if problems ever come up, then you can fix that and deal with that on the other side. All right, so let's get into the contract. We're going to start right here at the top. The most important thing on this page, one of the most important things on this page, is the offer date. I know it's going to sound kind of silly, but that's how you indicate this specific offer, right? Because that's what you're going to reference often is the offer date. Then, of course, you have the purchase and sale portion of identifying the property. Um, You can put, yeah, I love now that the address and all that's in there, MLS numbers, tax IDs if you have them. Um, what's your favorite way to do a legal description? Anybody?
Book and page.
Book and page, mine too. I am a big fan of book and page, deed book and page. You can find that in the tax records 99% of the time. And that leaves it up to the lawyers to determine if everything's perfect. Um, one of the things that we're going to go through as we go through this is the front page. Remember the way that our contract is structured, the front page is all the fill in the blanks so that you can just glance at it and see everything, which is super convenient, but often it means that people miss what actually comes behind this paragraph. So this is the section that comes behind this paragraph. Now, I won't ask, but at some point, you need to read through the entire contract. I highly recommend that you do this on at least an annual basis because it does change. When we did this class last year on the 2024 version, there were several things that many of us, myself included, I've been doing this 20 years, um, didn't know were in there that had changed some of the language and little slight changes that aren't huge necessarily, but impact how you're dealing with your clients and things. So you want to pay attention to those. So this is the section that comes behind that paragraph. The seller's warranting that at the time of closing, they can convey good and marketable title. There are lots of variations to that. There are limited warranties, all those sorts of things that you really need to be aware of. But you should be paying attention to what that title is going to come across. Title examination, obviously, the buyer is going to have title examination done. Usually, the closing attorney is going to do that. And then, of course, title insurance. Um, Title insurance is one of those things that people are like, gosh, that seems like it's expensive. Why should I get that? And I can tell you one of my favorite things to do is have training classes with title people, because title insurance people in particular, because they have all these horrible stories, real life stories, where people have lost their house or lost hundreds of thousands of dollars or had all kinds of issues with their property that was covered by title insurance, or not covered if they didn't have it. And so I think that's very important for people to understand that it is one of those things that if there's an issue and you can't, just because it's new construction on a newly developed lot doesn't make it safe. Just because it's a 1954 on a lot that's been there since 1950 doesn't make it safe. Like there's no way to make title safe, other than title insurance. Moving on to the purchase price. Purchase price, pretty straightforward. That's the price that you want to pay, right? That the buyer wants to pay. And so it's a sales price, purchase price, same thing. Closing costs. Closing costs can be used for anything. Um, that's allowed here under the mortgage lender if you have a mortgage lender. But as you say, it says it's including without limitation any compensation obligations of the buyer. So you could, if you want, now we don't recommend this necessarily, but you could theoretically include your buyer's compensation to you as a buyer's broker in this slot right here, because they're allowed to use this money for that as well. Most of the time, people separate it out because it makes it easier to manage. But I wouldn't be surprised if at some point in the future we start seeing that, just because it's all in there. It's already in this paragraph. Anything in here, any questions about, obviously prorations and things like that. Um, Prorations, it's important to pay attention to taxes in particular, especially when tax bills are coming out or have just come out. When things are wrong, how often do the people that sold the house come back and make it right? My experience is pretty minimally. They have to be pretty nice and functional people to actually do that. And your remedy for actually getting them to do it is not great. Because, you know, you're usually only talking about, I don't know, 500, 1,000, couple $1,000s. You're not talking, you know, tens of thousands of dollars. And so, you know, you can write a strongly worded letter, get an attorney to write a strongly worded letter. Closing attorney should help with that process. But if they just say, nah, forget it, then you kind of have to realize that that's a possibility. So pay attention to those prorations and expectations of what the tax bill might do. This time of year, that's very important because if people are buying a property that was not occupied as of January 1st, but has a homestead on it, what's going to happen to the taxes? That homestead's going to go away and their taxes are going to go way up. So you want to pay attention to that from that perspective. All right, moving on. Closing date and possession. Pretty straightforward, right? We want to have the closing date at such and such a date, and we want to take possession of the property either upon closing or X number of days after closing at a certain time. And of course, we need a temporary occupancy, which we'll cover in a later session. Right to extend the closing date. This is one that gets confused a lot. So let's talk about it for a minute. Buyers and sellers may unilaterally extend the closing date for 8 days upon notice to the other party prior to 8 p.m. on the date of closing. That's relatively new, by the way, the 8 p.m. if you weren't aware that that's in there. Seller cannot satisfy only if, these are the only reasons they can. If the seller cannot satisfy valid title objections, excluding title objections that can be satisfied through the payment of money or by bonding off the same, and do not prevent the seller from conveying good and marketable title as that term is defined herein to the property. Or two, the buyer's mortgage lender, including in the transactions where the financing contingency has expired, or the closing attorney is delayed and cannot fulfill their respective obligations by the date of closing, provided the delay is not caused by the buyer. If you've been in the business for a while, you know that people try to abuse this. Oh, I can't get, the lender is not able to close. Why? The buyer's funds are locked in their 401k and they're trying to get them out. That is the buyer's fault, not the lender's. Therefore, that is not a correct thing to use, a reasonable thing to use for a unilateral extension. The party that unilaterally extends states the basis, and if the right to unilaterally extend is exercised by either of the parties, then it is no longer available, right? So if the seller comes along and says, hey, I need to do a unilateral extension because of a title issue that I'm getting cleared up, and then the lender has an issue after that, buyer's SOL. It doesn't matter. So when you're going to use a unilateral extension, would you rather use a unilateral extension or a mutual extension?
Mutual.
Mutual, absolutely. Because then that leaves this unilateral available for future issues. So always try and push that way. Keys and openers. At closing, seller shall provide the buyer with all the keys, door openers, access cards, fobs, everything they have to access the property, the mailboxes, the gates, the whatever, right? Everything and everything. And then they should also provide instructions on how to contact a third party for anything that is required for that part. I am recording. Yes, Tina. Uh, and then devices and fixtures. Everything in there needs to be operated with a specific controller. For instance, ceiling fans that have those little remotes that you put on the wall, you got to make sure those get conveyed or left in the property, right? Like those need to be available. The little mini split HVAC systems that only operate off of a remote, if that remote's not there, how are you going to run that, right? So you want to make sure that you're paying attention to those sorts of things, and go through that. All right, on to the next page. Closing law firm. Who has the right to select the closing attorney?
Buyer.
Buyer.
Buyer. But why
But
is
the
the lender
seller,
always pushing to select the attorney? Why is it, oh, you want to use this, or if it's a builder,
mhm,
God help you, they are going to tell you
mhm,
you have to use these people, right?
mhm,
But no matter what they say, the buyer has the right to select their own attorney. So remember that, because if you're being bullied, call me and I'll help you, and we'll bully back. But from that standpoint, you want to make sure that the closing attorney, especially, you have to understand that if there's a mortgage, the closing attorney represents the lender, not the buyer. But it never hurts to have an attorney that you are comfortable with and have a relationship with because you know they're going to do a good job. So that's really why picking the closing attorney is really important, from that standpoint. Closing with, I've seen some of these mobile closing things and other random things that don't go very smoothly. And so, just pay attention to that as we go through. All right, holder of earnest money. Holder of earnest money. If the holder is a closing attorney, how many people want the closing attorney to hold the earnest money? Show of hands. No? Okay. Um, Part of the reason for that, I think, is with my group in particular, is that if the closing attorney is holding the earnest money, they may or may not choose to make an interpretation and release the funds if there's an issue, right? And while the forms have been modified to get them to basically agree that they can do that, they always have the right to just send it to arbitration. And that's not fun because that ends up costing you more money than typically you have in earnest money, unless it's a really big deal. So that's one of the things to pay attention to. The other thing to pay attention to in this, and I'm not going to read through it, I expect you guys can read, is that you obviously need to send notice that you have the earnest money and that it's been deposited. You want to send that over. But one of the other things that you want to know is that if for some reason there's an issue with the earnest money, for instance, your seller gives you a check, you give it to the office deposits it. A few days later, they let you know that, hey, by the way, that check was no good. What do you need to do? You need to immediately notify the other side that that check was no good. Now you have time to fix it, right? You have 3 days to cure it, but you need to notify the other side to make sure that it's everybody's aware because they can call that a default of the contract. Speaking of earnest money can be paid to the holder in any of the methods acceptable to the holder. No longer do you have to mark whether it's a wire, ACH, cash, whatever, cash. I mean, geez. Um, so you can do it as of the offer date. You can do it within X number of days, the binding agreement date, or you can write in your own little fancy wording that you want to. Again, be careful with verbiage, and make sure what you're saying is functional. If you mark A and you write as of the offer date, you write this offer up electronically. You aren't with your clients. You send them this offer, they e-sign it, and you send it over to the listing agent. What's wrong with that? Ryan, unmute yourself and tell me.
You don't have the money as of
You don't
the
have the money, probably, right? Like, because you're not with them.
yeah.
If you write that it is as of the offer date, you need to have that money in hand. Okay. Now they can deposit that through the portal, the ACH thing, like they can do that, but you need to make sure that's happening on that day and not the next day because that's a violation of the contract. And so you wouldn't want that to be an issue. Okay. All of the earnest money things, which you should read very clearly, and you should very much, this is one of those things that as you're going through the contract, which I hope you're doing with your clients, you're saying, I want you to make sure that you really read this section because this is their money. This is their on the books they have to deal with, and go from there. So entitlement to earnest money. Buyer is entitled to the earnest money if failure of the parties to enter into the binding agreement. So it never becomes a contract. failure of any unexpired contingency or condition which the agreement is subject, and termination of this agreement due to the default of the seller, or termination of the agreement in accordance with any of those contingencies. Otherwise, the earnest money shall be applied towards the purchase price of the property at closing, or if other funds are used to pay the purchase price, then the earnest money is returned to the buyer. This disbursement, if you have an issue where you have earnest money deposited, contract has been terminated, your client or the other side is due the earnest money, and you can't get them to sign the termination and release, which we have happen pretty regularly, you need to look very much at the timelines here. As soon as someone basically says, hey, I'm not going to cooperate and let you get your earnest money back, you need to notify the brokers and get a 10-day letter written, or the holder, really, not the brokers. Sorry to clarify, the holder. You need to notify the holder and make sure that they get that 10-day letter out, because that 10-day clock has to run. There is no accelerating that. There's no waiving that. There's no, if it's not signed, then we have to do the letter. We have to do the 10 days. We have to wait for them to respond. We have to, all of those sorts of things. So you want to get that clock ticking sooner than later. I see a lot of agents give people the benefit of the doubt. Oh, they're going to get to it. They're going to get to it. They're going to get to it. A couple of weeks go by. Oh, yeah, they're still going to get to it. Don't do that to your clients, right? If they haven't gotten to it in 2 or 3 days, they aren't going to get to it. They're not planning on getting to it. So go ahead, let's get the 10-day letter done. Let's get it out and get the money to your clients. The interpleaders and the hold harmless, as always, the disputes if they need to be. Inspection and due diligence. All right, this is a big one. Due diligence period. Property is being sold subject to a due diligence period of X number of days from the binding agreement date. If you write the number 5 in there, is that 5 calendar days or is that 5 business days? Does that include holidays? How does that work?
Calendar.
Calendar, yes. It is just calendar days. If you write 5B in there, no one knows what that is. Okay. So you better be making some kind of special stipulation that says any dates, number of days with the letter B behind it are hereby defined as business days or something, right? Don't assume that people are going to be able to pick it apart. The one phrase that I use all the time is that if you had to stand in front of a judge and defend this contract, and you had to say to that judge, well, I wrote 5B. Doesn't everybody know that B stands for business days? What do you think that judge is going to say? No way, no how, right? Ha ha ha. Good luck. Try again next time. So you want to be able to defend this in court if you have to. If you take that approach, you will make sure all of the I's are dotted and T's are crossed, because you don't ever want to be in court. I've been there. It's not fun. And it's not a good time. Then, of course, you have the option payment for due diligence. That's a big thing these days where, well, less these days, but back in the crazy market, where people would pay the seller directly additional money, right? And so that's also an option that you can still do. You can also just put NA in there. So let's look at the inspection and due diligence section of wording, because there's a bunch. There's a whole nother page. Buyer's right to inspect the property. The property is being sold in as is condition, with any and all faults. Okay. So many people write into their contract, property as is. It's already in there. Every property that you write a contract on is as is. That's the way it is. Now, can you negotiate if you have issues? Of course, that's what due diligence is for. But the reality is that every property is being sold in the condition that it is when you write the offer. Okay. These paragraphs that have this bold language in them, there's a reason why they put it in bold. It's to make sure that the parties read it, right? because it's a long contract. It's not that long. California contract's like a book. This is, what, 8 pages or something? It's not that big a deal. Oh, 10 pages. Sorry, I'm looking at it now. 10 pages. It was 8 not that long ago. And so these bold things you want to make sure, again, as you're going through the contract with your client, which I believe you should do, you can do it virtually, but go through it on the screen, go through the contract. Point out that, hey, if the buyer's concerned about things, like this particular one happens to be meth lab, you can look that crap up on the DEA website. Okay, so they should look that up. Buyer's responsibility to inspect the neighborhood. I would absolutely, as I was going through this with a buyer, point out that this says that they're responsible for inspecting the neighborhood, not you. They need to determine if that neighborhood is the right kind of neighborhood for them, whatever that means to them, right? And again, sex offender website. You want to look it up? Look it up. Here it is. Okay. Moving on in inspection stuff. The right to inspection continues through closing. We had one not long ago where the listing agent said, "Oh no, you can't come back, and you don't need to come back through the property. You didn't ask to come back through the property. Ask like I'm allowed to come back through the property. Like that's just normal. You should be doing walkthroughs right before closing. This is your right to inspect through closing. Okay. In buyer's indemnification obligations. So buyer's going to hold, remember, these contracts are written to protect us. Okay. The GAR contracts are very much written to protect the real estate agents. And so there's a hold harmless in here, indemnification, that if for some reason the buyer hurts themselves or whatever, then we're not responsible for dealing with that, right? It's not our fault that they tripped or whatever. Due diligence period explains the due diligence period, which I think everybody at this point is probably comfortable with. The reality is that by the end of that due diligence period, if it has not terminated, you're not changing anything without a signed amendment, and you do not have the right to terminate. And if whatever you're going to agree to needs to be signed off on before it ends, right? Seller's duty to disclose. Seller is required by law to disclose latent or hidden defects that could not be discovered. This is an important phrase, that could not be discovered by the buyer during a reasonably careful inspection of the property. So a lot of sellers, especially absentee seller type people, don't want to fill out full disclosures. Is that okay? Can they not fill out a disclosure? Yes, they don't have to fill out a disclosure. They are legally allowed to not fill out a disclosure. There's a secondary disclosure that is just latent defect disclosure that you can use. That is good for investor types or people that haven't been in the property because it's really limited in what you're disclosing. But they also don't legally have to fill that out if they don't know any latent defects or any hidden defects. Now, let's talk about a hole in the roof. If there's a hole in the roof, I can see daylight when I walk in the front door by looking up. Does the seller need to fill out a latent defect disclosure saying that there's a hole in the roof?
No,
Because that is very, very obvious, right? Like that is something that everyone is going to see. What about the rodent problem in the crawl space? I mean,
probably obvious on inspection.
right, any inspector is going to see that, right? Now, here's where I would caution. If you think there might be a reason to disclose it, then you probably should disclose it, right? Because over disclosing has never, in my career, I've never had an issue where over disclosing was a problem. Over disclosing protects the seller from further issues. So that's the beauty of that. So if there's a rodent problem in the crawl space, and the seller says, hey, yeah, there's a rodent problem in the crawl space. Yeah, you should probably just go ahead and write that down. Okay. Or better, why don't we get that fixed before we list, right? Like, let's deal with that. It's not that bad to get rid of, right? That's a reasonable one. So things like that. Warranties transfer, any warranties on anything in the property, basically, the seller agrees to transfer to the buyer. And then, of course, repairs, all agreed upon repairs and replacements shall be performed in a good and workmanlike manner prior to closing unless otherwise agreed to in writing by the buyer and seller. This very clearly states, and I know a lot of people put it in their amendment to address concerns and whatever. This is everything has to be done well, like properly. Does it say they have to use a professional? No. Does it say that they have to provide receipts? No.
Mm-mm.
Nope.
So those sorts of things, if you want to say, then you need to say. Go ahead, Adam.
Brett, going back to seller's property disclosure and disclosure of latent defects, help me explain to a seller, and many times it's an investor who's never lived there, maybe they've had renters, or maybe it was a result of a probate. Help me explain to that seller during the listing presentation why it's important that they fill that out.
So it's a liability issue. I can tell you multiple lawsuits that I've been engaged in. Unfortunately, if you've been in the business a long time, it's hard not to have gotten in one. That the seller failed to disclose something properly. They didn't disclose, and it was later found that they knew about flooding issue or rodent problem or whatever, and that caused them an issue. If they fill out, especially if it's an investor or third party, they can fill out that latent defect one, which is pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. It's not a huge form compared to the full disclosure. Then that at least says that they have attempted to disclose everything that they have, right? So that it shows a good faith effort. The reality is that if as long as they don't lie on it, they should be fine. But again, not a lawyer. So I would say, definitely be careful of how that plays out from that perspective.
Right.
Yeah.
I use the latent defects with a lot of my clients that are executors of their
Yeah.
parents' home where they've passed away. And I spoke with an attorney about it because before I was using the regular disclosure,
Yeah.
and they said you should use the latent defects because they've never lived in the home. Because I had a situation before on another deal where we used the regular disclosure and turned into a nightmare. So she said, start using this one. It covers you because they've never lived in the home. And it's basically 3 check boxes. And then the only other thing they have to fill out is what they're leaving with the property. And it's very simple. So you're covered, that you really don't know anything about the property because you've never lived there.
Right. And even if you did live there 20 years ago or 10 years ago or whatever, right? An executor situation where it was your family home or whatever, you don't have current knowledge of it.
Right.
And there's way too many questions on the regular disclosure that you just aren't going to be able to answer.
Mm-hmm.
So be aware of the latent defect one. It is very helpful. Very, very.
Yeah.
So thanks for that. That's a good real world example. All right, let's talk about lead-based paint disclosures because those are important too, right? Lead-based paint. To the best of the seller's knowledge, the residential dwellings on the property, including any portion thereof or painted fixture therein, was or was not built prior to 1978. That beautiful antique mantle that's from 1920 that's in my 2005 house that I know is an antique mantle. Do I need to check was?
Yes.
Yes, because it very clearly says or painted fixture therein. Now, if that beautiful antique mantle is just wood and not painted, do I need to check yes?
Nah.
No. If instead of a mantle, it's I don't know, a beautiful credenza in the hall, that's from the 30s that's painted. Do I need to check yes?
Are you taking it or leaving it? The
Here's the deal.
credenza.
Whether I'm taking it or leaving it, if it's not a fixture, so it's just sitting on the floor in the hallway, that is not a part of the property,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
So that does not meet that qualification of needing to be prior to 1978. Okay. So if there is an issue, you think that there's an issue, ask. If in doubt, check yes and disclose. Um, Very important that and this just goes on to explain that, right? And that the buyer has the right to conduct lead hazard evaluation within 10 days. Most buyers waive that for some reason. I'm not sure why. um, but, even if you had no due diligence, if you don't waive that 10-day, you can go in and do a lead-based paint test during those 10 days. So just something to consider. I'm not sure why everybody waives that, or not everybody, but so many people do, because that's something that I think is reasonable to ask for. All right. That's it.
But Brett, could we look? I think we can look at the lead-based paint exhibit later
We will, yes. We will look at the
because I
lead-based paint
think that's
exhibit
where I think
specifically.
that's where
Yes.
that language comes in about
That's
why
where that
people check
happens. Yes,
waive it.
that's where the waiver happens. Correct. Yes. And we will look at that. And I'm shock and awed, but that's my last slide for today. Next time we'll pick up with the brokerage relationships and the time limits, and then go into the signature pages and the attachments and those sorts of things. So I know you all, that Ken's just flabbergasted that we're done already, right? Like that's insane. So questions, let's talk about anything that we didn't talk about, anything that you have real world concerns or thoughts. We got, 5 or 6 more minutes. Let's talk about them. Adam?
Just for consistency's sake, any suggestions for any blanks on the form that you're not asking for a dollar amount or a date or anything like that?
NA is always a great thing to do. If it's not relevant, if it's not something that's part of the contract, just put N/A, right? That's my favorite thing to do, because then again, there's no question that you didn't miss it and you forgot to put something. It's no, we absolutely acknowledge that this blank is here and it is not relevant to our contract. Good question. Robin?
Brett, the one comment on the holder or the if the closing attorney is a holder of the earnest money.
Mhm.
Another potential complication is if the buyer is a cash buyer, then the closing attorney is representing the buyer and they're holding the earnest money, and that could maybe not be in your seller's best interest.
Definitely.
Just saying.
Yep. If you're on the listing side, that's definitely something to consider. But at the same time, if we as a brokerage are holding the earnest money and we represent the buyer, we represent the
Mm-hmm.
buyer, right? So it's
No,
similar. It's similar. But
no.
I mean, the reality is that the contract is what the contract is. That's why it has
Mm-hmm.
to be in writing, because
Mm-hmm.
if it's ambiguous, you know what's going to happen. It doesn't matter who's holding earnest money. If it's ambiguous
Mm-hmm.
and it's not clear and there's not an agreement between the parties, the holder's going to force an agreement. They're going to say,
Mm-hmm.
we're not releasing this until you have an agreement.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Most.
and I would say we really encourage you to try to have us hold the earnest money over an attorney or anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Because
Brett, I
then
have a real world scenario happening. Earnest money is still late. They agreed to some additional earnest money in order for us to extend the agreement. It was due Monday. It is Friday. Is it the notice form I'm sending over today?
well, so are you on the late side or the party receiving
Party
the?
receiving. I'm
Okay,
representing the seller.
you're representing the seller. So you theoretically could have sent notice like Tuesday to say that it's late. that you haven't gotten it. And I assume you've had communication with the agent, so you know that's why
Eh.
it's still not there.
Yeah.
And so, yes, you want to send that official notice of the earnest money. And so I think that's in here.
And is that just the GAR, the notice form, the generic
Yeah,
one?
just a notice and just write on there that, seller is notifying the buyer that they are in default of the contract, for not delivering the earnest money or something along those lines. I would definitely use the phrase "you are in default of the contract," just because that's usually the strongest thing you can say. And then that takes care of it. And then they have 3 days to fix that.
So I don't have to put a date on it or, okay, they've got 3. All right, got it. Thank you.
Good one. Relevant. I love it when
Mhm.
relevant. Hey, we get enough people on the phone, on the call. I guarantee you're dealing with something in one of these sections, right? Like that's just
Yep.
a common issue. Um, all right, last trivia question for the day. If I fail to put a legal description on the property, all I do is write the address on it. Is my contract voidable?
Yes.
Yes, it is. So please, please, please make sure every contract you send and every contract you receive, has a legal description in some way, form, or another. So,
So you're saying just go to the listing and look at the tax record from there for the book and page is what
if
you
you go,
typically use.
yep, if you go to Realist, at the bottom of the tax record, there's a document number, that's part of the warranty deed or whatever.
Mhm.
And you can literally go and it's a number slash number or number dash number. It's always book and page. So you can just put that right in.
Brett,
Uh,
I've had some old ones that I could not find even that
okay.
way.
Yep.
And so then I had to go in the county tax and go in and find it that way.
Yep.
And it took some time to figure it out, but I was able to find it, and then of course verified that that was the correct property
And so
by pulling it up through
did you go through
GSCCCA.
GSCCCA?
No, I
Okay,
went through
so
the county
oh God.
tax, and I
So
pulled up the tax, like the tax bill and the prior
right,
ones, and
right.
finally you find the book and page number
Okay.
listed on there.
If you send a request to Ruth, she will pull all of that information for you if you ever need
Hmm.
it
Yeah.
as well. I know Donna
Yeah.
sent that out yesterday,
Yep.
but she's a
Hmm.
great resource, and especially like on listings, she can go ahead and give you the legal description and everything. So
Hmm.
feel free to reach out to her, and that's not at any expense.
Yep. No, that's a nice partnership perk there.
It was actually in one of the training that on the board of realtors where I am, they had somebody which talked about even on the new constructions. It is better to have your title search before you have everything
Hmm.
from the book deed and everything on it, because it could be that land and the developer got in everything, and it should something that it was like 50 years ago. Some of the people who were in the deed were not recompensed by the whoever sold it, and you lost that one. So the best way they teach is to go and do the title search before you feel anything that is giving out from the FMLS or from deed book and page and everything, because title will give you everything on it.
And so you're speaking as a listing agent, right?
Right, like a
Okay.
listing agent, if you're doing with root is the best way to have it. Absolutely.
Yeah. No, and the other nice thing about that is, how often do we list properties and all we do is rely on the tax records to know who the owners are?
Right.
That's not
Hmm.
necessarily accurate.
No.
Or Jimmy comes along and says, "Yeah, this is my property. Here's a little quick precursory title search." Definitely helps us at least somewhat validate that we're dealing with the right people. So that's not a bad thing to do as a listing
And
agent at all.
And I deal with a lot of, like I said, executors and things like that. You've got to see how it is joint right of survivorship, because that can cause issues at closing. I've had some, they didn't realize it, and then they've had to go get it probated before being listed. And
Yeah.
yeah, definitely worth
Yeah.
having it researched.
Anytime you have a non-standard, hey, I'm a living normal soul and I own this property, if it's a business, if it's a corporation, if it's an executor, if it's anybody else that's dealing with the property, you want to go through and have your attorney, your title person verify that you have everything you need to be able to sell the property. Because you don't want to find out after it's under contract that, oh, we're gonna have to probate. That's gonna take 6 months. That's not fun.
Yeah.
You look like you know what you're doing. So, all right, good. Thank you guys